Welcome back, everyone. Please take your seats. So it's my great honor to introduce the first panel on mining, labor, and finance. And our first speaker is Vasiliki Makrygianni. She's an architect coming from Aristotelian University of Thessaloniki. She also has a background in urban studies. And she's going to present to us research on gold and copper mining in Chalkidiki in Greece. So welcome, Vasiliki.
Can you maybe help me with finding my presentation? Yeah, where do you have it? I thought it was on the desktop.
Yeah, we didn't. I think it's in the doc. Yes.
Okay.
That's it, right?
Okay. Okay, so I hope you can hear me. Thank you for having us here. Thanks to all the organizers. It's lovely to be here. So I guess I have something like 20 minutes to wait. Sorry, I need to share.
You remember the instructions which you used to do?
Wait.
I think it's from here. Yeah. Is it this one? No. Let's see, one sec. How do we get the presentation to show? This one?
Share the screen.
Yes.
Oh, is that okay? It's huge. Yeah. Okay, great. Oh, no. Yeah. Okay. Great. So this presentation is on the case of a gold and copper mining site in northern Greece. The site is named Skouries, and this research has been taking place the last few years. And this presentation is a collective project, actually, with my dear friend and colleague Kostas Petrakos, who couldn't travel, but I think he's online watching. Kostas has his PhD thesis on extractivism and social struggles and social resistance. And this is a work in progress. We have already published a paper a few years ago on the so-called golden salto mortale. And now we're expanding our research as the extraction is expanding and as the materials are expanding. So we're looking into the new dimensions of this mining site in terms of the multiplication and expansion of renewable energy projects, the new materials to be extracted, which is copper and zinc in this case, and the COVID crisis framework. So this investment has taken the character of a socio-spatial conflict, which takes place in the rural and in the urban Greek metropolis site. And overall, what we're trying to do throughout our analysis is to unfold, on one hand, the spillover effects of extractivism that are very severe and persistent, and B, on the other hand, counter spillover effects regarding the proliferation of struggles against extractivism and energy infrastructure projects. So to begin to orientate you a little bit on the side of the research, so this is the ground zero of the conflict. It's Chalkidiki, a region in northern Greece. Ironically, the mining site is in the municipality of Aristotle. This is the supposed Aristotle's birthplace. And the mine, as I mentioned, has gold, copper, and zinc deposits. So during the last decade, there's this Canadian company called Eldorado, which has undertaken this mining investment. And that means that Eldorado Gold holds the exploitation rights of an area that includes 16 villages and around 19,000 inhabitants. Also, this is an environmentally sensitive area. You can see here on the map the spatial intersection between the Natura site and the mining site. And as you can imagine, there are several implications. On a local level, this project entitles the state to block the development of other productive activities, such as small-scale agriculture and forest activities, based on the principle that the entire area could be considered as a potential mine. But the consequences and the rootings of such activities, as it's well known, they are spread more globally. So moving to a wider scale, to a bird's eye view, if we pay attention to the Eldorado Gold's origins, we can have an idea on the global distribution of such activities. So we think that Canada provides an excellent case study for exploring the expansion of the extractive frontier and land dispossession across the globe. I'm talking about the role of the Canadian extractive capital and the Canadian state itself. So in our case, Eldorado operates in Greece, but Eldorado Gold share is traded on Toronto Stock Exchange market. This map basically shows the geographical distribution of Canadian mining assets. It's a map of 2020. And with this distribution, we kind of think that Canada's role is twofold. Abroad, it engages with what it's called extractivist imperialism. And this, for instance, includes diplomatic pressure on governments, the direct foreign aid development program to countries on condition of establishing mining projects in their territories. And at the same time, they advertise the corporate social responsibility of Canadian multinationals. And at home, neocolonialism flourishes as they promote basically oil and mining exploitation on the indigenous territories. So after this short introduction, I believe I gave you an idea of what we're dealing with, our case. And what I'm going to do right now is to introduce briefly first of all, some methodological and epistemological notes, few key points on our theoretical framework. And in order to map the expansion of mining extractivism, as promised in the abstract, we thought we should focus on 4 key points in order to do this mapping, which is space, materials, policies, and resistance. And then some concluding remarks, which would entail the counter spillover of struggles and extractivism. So starting with how we worked so far, we draw from feminist scholarship and decolonial approaches. We are working a lot in an intersectionality framework. That means that we take into account the parallel systems of oppression and violence, in this case, mainly on the basis of gender and class, in order to select our sample and discuss our theory. We also draw from scholarship of the social production of space and the critical theories of space. And we use a constant alteration of scales. This is very crucial for us when we want to analyze all this multiscalar nature of extraction, which we think that spreads from the digital realm of logistics to transnational territories and to local communities' everyday lives. We engage with agency and the propositional line of thought. And we have conducted active participatory fieldwork research carried out in the wider area between 2013 and 2021. So to understand extractivism, this natural resource appropriation, we follow current debates on extractivism coming from scholars like Swampa, Costa, Gudinas, and perhaps I should better say extractivisms in plural. I'm not going to add much on that to save some time. After all, it's a conference on extractivism. But on this basis, we're particularly interested on the expansion of the notion of extractivism in terms of resources, of modalities, and of conflict. And therefore, what we do is we discuss the extractive activities also beyond the physical side of the mine. And there's a growing literature on that, on the nexus, of finance and extraction and logistics, which inspires us. I'm talking about the works of Sandro Mezzandra, of Gago, of De Los Reyes, of Nelson, and so on. So this is basically where we draw from. And in this framework, yes, we pay particular attention to the so-called spillover effects that are introduced by goodiness. For instance, I'm talking about the transformations generated beyond the particular mining site that include, among other, territorial disputes, commodification of social life and nature, and compensatory state logics. So, for instance, in Greece, the push of extractivism has consequences for the rest of the country, such as changes in public policies and spatial planning. And all in all, I'm talking about the change of the conception of nature itself. Also in the Constitution. This is an interesting example to share with you. And we're also inspired, the last point, from recent critical scholarship on the nexus of energy extraction and extraction regarding the supply of energy transition minerals that support renewable energy systems. So this process of capital accumulation by renewables is also driven by the eco-modernist myth and energy injustice. So the emerging new order creates a new resource curse associated with a low carbon supply chain and access to critical materials. There's a growing literature which highlights that decarbonizing the economy involves an intensification of mining activities with an increased demand for more than 20 metal commodities to facilitate the energy transition. And it also highlights the path-dependent nature of processes and decisions that effectively lock people, communities, and entire economies into a particular development trajectory, which can in turn generate violent conflicts. So, to start mapping the roots of extractivism, we followed the traces of Tollardo's activities to begin with. So basically, this map shows the spatial imprints of the capital circulation of Tollardo. And of course, it's interesting to look more throughout the ways, on the practicalities, on the methods of Tollardo. For instance, in the European Union, Tollardo is engaged in aggressive tax avoidance. We should also mention the infiltration of Tollardo in the administration, both at the local and national levels. I'm talking about now the pretext of jobs created from its activity, linked with the concept of corporate social responsibility. So basically, in Skouries' case, promises of using local workforce shape a conflict between parts of the local communities. This is a very well-known corporate strategy that has continued to shape the area until today, even though the company now, with the new agreement that I'm going to talk about, is disengaged from this obligation of employing locals in its premises. So to move further with this mapping, along with the spatial expansion of mining activities and assets, we pay attention to the minerals themselves extracted and their roots. First of all, we notice the intensification of worldwide extraction. It has tripled during the last 4 decades, as UNEP report documents. And in this map of 2020, we can see the extractive activities of different minerals around the globe, linked, of course, with various capitalistic activities, including, of course, the digital realm. And the already visible new commodity super cycle, spurred by Green Deal and post-pandemic recovery programs, will deepen and expand extractivism. So the thing is that these materials, their roots, their geographies, they're very often black boxed. So it's not very easy actually to map. In our case, we know that they're mainly transported, the minerals from the Skouries coal mine, they're mainly transported from the port of Thessaloniki. But over there, in specific parts, access is forbidden, and we don't know much on the whereabouts of the materials. It's basically disclosed information so far. However, we do suspect that the extraction of the Skouries materials and the forthcoming shift from gold to copper and zinc is linked with the energy transition from fossil fuels to green technologies. Goldman Sachs says copper is the new oil. Copper is well known for its capacity to conduct electricity, an indispensable component for computer hardware. and of course other and other activities that are quite essential to today's capitalism. And we also know that it's a crucial mineral for wind turbines, for solar panels, and for electronic networks. And this photo presents the importance of copper and other metals such as zinc in the construction of clean energy technologies. This is in this map we can see the spread of the wind turbines around Greece in the last few years, from 2013, 2014 and on. And then the fourth point of our mapping involves policies and the legislative framework. So we have numerous policies and legislative amendments approved during the Greek socio-economic crisis and the recent COVID crisis. You can name them state of exception situations, or else the alliance between capital and indebted state. So in this framework of poly-crisis, as Sandra Mezzano mentioned earlier, we would like to highlight two cases that we find very indicative. The first case is the new investment agreement signed by the Greek government during the COVID lockdown measures. And with this agreement, they actually form a special economic zone in north and east Chalkidiki. So basically, Eldorado is somehow recognized as the absolute owner of the entire area, which includes, of course, the entire underground aquifer. So there's a limitless amount of water that can be used according to the company's will. And on top of that, any activity that's on the side that is seen as conflicting with the interests of the investment is being prosecuted. So in Greece, extractivism operates in a formally democratic regime, but it's imposed, but all these actions are imposed by using and tolerating violence, breaching human rights of all kinds, and involving networks of corruption. In particular, Eldorado rewarded the former and the current municipal authority for its support by subsidizing the public services and the police. And at the same time, the company was advertising its investment at the schools of the region, and they created a tourism organization in order to demonstrate the compatibility between extraction and cultural tourism in the area. And then the second point, the second case, is a law of 2014, which was enriched and renewed in 2020, which is linked, basically it showcases the environmental and territorial spillover effects. So basically the law of 2014 was to allow and favor the specific project. Basically it permitted the construction of building installations in the forest of Skouries. And now this direct facilitation of Eldorado for this specific case project has been taken advantage by other ventures, even non-extractivists, throughout the country, such as the wind turbines and so on. So basically now the current government during the COVID crisis in 2020 approved a new law and described it as a promising step to the modernization of the Greek environmental legislation. With this law, they approved reforms in the terrestrial and the marine protected areas in order to allow the entry of, I have still 5 minutes, thank you, of oil and mining companies, as well as the establishment of renewable energy projects. And they permitted the expansion of agricultural investment known as monocultures. And these activities, of course, involve deep territorial changes. So we're witnessing new extractive and green energy geographies that are heavily protected by the state to spread and occupy much of Greece's territory. So, as I said in the beginning of this presentation, we try to unfold the spillover effects of capitalist and state activities, but also the counter spillover effects, as we call them, regarding the proliferation of struggles against extractivism and energy infrastructures. So in this timeline that we've published some years ago, and now we added more data on it, we kind of trying to spot the numerous legislative amendments and the struggle against them, the responses against them that have been rising during all these multiple crises that I just mentioned. COVID, socioeconomic crisis, and the name of the next crisis we're waiting for. I don't know what that would be. So I don't have much time to go deeper on that, but we just want to highlight two things: that during the total lockdown of May 2020, during the COVID crisis, the first social mobilization took place, and it was about the passage of the environmental law. And 5 months later, a network of collectivities against mining and renewable energy projects was established on a national level this time. And then in 2021, again, during lockdown measures, hundreds of permits for renewable energy projects in Greek mountains were granted to national and transnational corporations, several of which they face severe resistance from the communities and movements. So we have a big networking over there. It is an escalating conflict. Let me give you just one example. Recently, we had lawsuits by multinational companies that have targeted independent Greek journalists because they published information about their businesses. And we have a female journalist in Thessaloniki in particular who was targeted by an executive of Eldorado demanding 100,000 euros. For Greece, this is a huge amount. In damages over an article published in 2020 about the executive's criminal conviction. So with reference to struggles, throughout these years, local residents have formed struggle committees, they organized mass demonstrations, they occupied the local police station, several times they blocked the local road network in order to prevent the riot police from entering their homes. They had real conflicts, very violent conflicts over there at the villages. And at the same time, there was a big solidarity movement that they formed assemblies, concerts, festivals, and summer camps around the forest that was in danger. So there was, first of all, a geographical spread of these resistant practices in the major Greek cities of Athens and Thessaloniki. And currently, the Save Skouries movement participates in Don't Dig, which is a common initiative of Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus against the extractions and war. So in short, this initiative ranges its activities from the privatization of the energy market and energy poverty to the destructive way in which extraction and industrial-scale renewable energy are being promoted in different parts of the country, especially the Aegean Sea, and networks the movements that are being built against it. And B, a spread of struggles in the local social nexus, which is also a very interesting case study, which just to emphasize on the feminist perspective that rose during the struggles. So on several occasions, women tried to break the police blockage in order to approach the mountain. They successfully blocked the entrance of the construction site several times. But at the same time, and I would say most importantly, they got involved in a wider and a more molecular struggle that involved their everyday lives and all the power mechanisms that were reproduced and reproduced by gender division of labor and on. And I still have 1 minute left. So these are photos from the annual festival of last July in Skouries. Free coming was organized in order for people to meet, discuss, and exchange ideas. What is characteristic of the struggle is that they choose not to enter in negotiations with institutional actors. Instead, and most importantly, they challenge a preconceived rationality, currently that of the market and of the development or growth, and they became able to articulate a different reason. So basically, the last year's declaration of the committees chose to stress in two things. One, the state of exception created during crisis situations, and the new means of materials of capitalism. So to sum up, we agree with this quote of Naomi Klein, that climate change is a crisis produced by an extractive mindset and so on. However, at the same time, we notice a parallel spillover effect, a counter spillover effect with regards to struggles around the country. And this spillover effect is structurally networked and circulated. It arises on the basis of some common agents of oppression, which lead to formulating a critique against development. It highlights the power imbalances and the importance of the contestation of neoliberal policies at an international level. And it introduces a variety of resistance strategies and actions, such as litigation, collaborations between activists and scientists, and local assemblies and referendums on the rejection of the development projects. And I think I exhausted my time, so I will stop here. And thank you so much for listening.
So I would like to welcome our second speaker for this panel, Gustav Kalm, who is a PhD candidate in anthropology at Columbia University. He also has a background as a lawyer, and he's going to present a paper titled Capitalizing on Competing Property Titles in the Simandou Iron Ore Reserves in Guinea. investor-state arbitration versus host-stranger relations. So welcome, Gustav.
No, but I think I can print. Yes? No? No? Then I want to. I don't want to duplicate. I want to extend. But then how do I see it? No, but I don't want it. Yes, but why doesn't it show me here? Because it shows this. Because I would like it so it shows me the presenter view here.
Oh, right, okay.
And so I want to extend.
Yeah.
But
I think you just go on the presentation and then.
How do I go on the presentation?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I understood now. Okay. Okay.
And
All good. All good.
View, select.
Yeah, all I understood now.
Yeah.
Good. Excellent. No, it still doesn't.
No, you need to select the presenter view.
Okay, thank you. Right. Hello. Sorry for the little delay. The title is Sen. I'm very happy to present here, and thank you for accepting me at this very interesting event here. But I'll jump straight into the matters as not to lose time. So in 2019, I was for the first time in the village of Damaro in Guinea. And I was walking around with my local guide, a carpenter by the name of Mohammed, who brought me to this site a few kilometers from the village on his motorbike, where formerly the Brazilian mining company Vale had its base. And here you can see the remaining parts of the mineral exploration that was left behind. In French, they are called carrots, and I like that word in English too, because they do look like carrots. I think formally the term in English is different, that have been drilled from the ground. And all this was left to a sort of state of abandon because the operations there had been cut short 5 years earlier. So on the base and various parts, you could see left behind equipment, destroyed toilets and various other equipments. People from the village, quite rightly so, used the various remaining pipes and other construction materials for their own benefit. Although they had been really angry at the mining company, as Mohammed was telling him, showing me these pieces of rubber, that they were angry mostly because the mining company had never really built proper stone houses. Instead, the mining company had only put up plastic tents and no real structures. Their presence had been seen as temporary. He even told me that the French word caoutchouc that he used for this had become a sort of a slur in the village to tell of something that is not a real presence. And as we walked further along in the base, he then also pointed me towards this field, which turned out was his manioc field that he was currently hosting on the former basis of the mining company that was in a sort of legal limbo at the time in terms of whom it belonged to. And then as we further, and the field was very nicely tended, I have to admit. And as we walked further along, he also pointed me towards this orchard and a fence that was cutting through the orchard. And I asked about it curiously, and he said that it used to be formerly his father's orchard, that when the mining company came, they built the fence through it, not caring about the former orchard. And, you know, with obvious scenarios of accumulation by dispossession running through my head, I asked him, so Mohammed, you must have been truly angered at this fact. And he looked at me surprised. Said that, no, my father gave the orchard to the mining company so they would come here. And the mining companies did in fact come. So here I show in the map where the Simandou mountain chain is located in Guinea. It is one of the biggest iron ore reserves in the world. It has a very high quality, very high hematite content. It's comparable to the Carajas, I don't speak Portuguese, region in Brazil. And it's a beautiful verdoyant mountain chain, and the extraction of the mineral there would be relatively easy. It would be an open pit mine. You just need to put it on trucks or trains and ship it to the ports, which is the main problem in many ways, because it is so far from the coast that the construction requires the construction of a railway, which according to, and the Guinean government has been opposing the shorter route through the area, and they've been wanting it to go through Guinea through an old French colonial project to build a Trans-Guinean railway, the cost of which is currently estimated to be at $15 billion US. But the short history of those mining companies that did in fact come is a rocambolesque story of corruption, suits and counter-suits, and no mining to date. So in 1997, the Anglo-Australian mining giant Rio Tinto had acquired an exploration permit, for which in 2006, they got a mining concession. Now in 2008, half of their concession is revoked and passed on to a small Israeli mining company, BSTR, named after the Israeli magnate Benny Steinmetz, who'd made his money in diamond business and accused of funding civil war in Sierra Leone, amongst others. In 2010, Vale, the Brazilian mining company, acquires a 51% share in BSTR's Guinea operation for $2.5 billion US, of which they paid 500 million. In Guinea in 2010, there are also somewhat democratic elections for the first time, and Alpha Condé is elected president and supported by figures, among whom also the prime funder of this gracious university here, George Soros, but also Tony Blair and many other people. And he engages in a process of mining review, but that's also based on popular demand in Guinea in 2007 general strike. And so in 2014, the mining rights of BSTR Vale are revoked based on a corruption investigation. And since Soros had also funded many international law firms, very complex international criminal investigations are begun. And in Switzerland, for the first time, there is conviction of an international corruption ring that comes later out of this. And then in 2014, BSTR pursues then Guinea in the World Bank International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes in investor-state arbitration. And there's over 10 other related cases that are opened that I've worked through. And then now it's very recent news in 2021, then Benny Steinmetz gets a 5-year prison sentence in Geneva. Obviously, he's contesting it. And in 2022, Guinea wins in exit arbitration, so they're judged right for having taken over those mining rights. And a new contract was recently signed where the current military junta that came to power about a little less than a year ago, Rio Tinto, a winning consortium, which is a Guinean, Chinese, Singapore, Lebanese consortium, are building together the rail line, possibly. But clearly, Mohammed's father's dreams did not materialize in terms of the mining company coming there, bringing what one would expect would be a form of income or prosperity. So the question that I'm asking in this presentation is how do different parties unlock value in the present from a mine that is still to be built in the future? And I start with, the question itself perhaps is it's an old question, as we said, Marx in volume 3, but then Thorstein Veblen or John Commons or Nitzen and Bichler or Fabian Muniz, a variety of authors have written about processes of capitalization and assetization under the conditions of what is sometimes called financial capitalism or financialization. I have found particularly useful the fame from this legal scholar, Katharina Pister, who sees capital as a combination of an asset and a legal code. And so the asset can be a variety of things. In this concrete case, talking about minerals in the ground. And the legal code could also be construed in many different ways. Some of the most common building blocks are property, contract, and corporation. And property itself is never also a singular right, but it's a multiple right? Like in the classical Roman law case, there is usus, fructus, and abusus. You can live in an apartment, you can rent it out, and you can sell it. But all these three rights do not always need to come together. They can also be separated from one another. In the very classical sort of frame of lawyers, property is a bundle of rights, right? So these different rights would have different abilities. They might have different rules of priority, different durability in time. They might have different versions of universality. and they might be more or less convertible. So what I'm interested here is then how property of this mountain chain can be coded differently, how it can be scaled differently, and how this would impact different parties' ability to accumulate capital, what I would call in some very rude formation social power, but basically ability to impact other actors' courses of actions. And I'll go over the different parties in the story. And I'll briefly say this is based on my dissertation research, which involved which more largely looks at international investment protection, and it's based on a 1 year of fieldwork with investor-state arbitration and project finance lawyers in Paris, and about 6 months of fieldwork in Guinea, and then reading in the Simandou mountain chain and in Conakry, and then reading through, I mean, all in all, over 15,000 pages of submissions in the ICSID arbitration between BSGR and Guinea, which is so far the investor-state arbitration where most material was rendered public. And I also read through the mining contracts and some of the material from these other court cases that came public. And I worked together with journalists with whom we've tried to get some of more confidential material also. So I'll start with Rio Tinto. So what brought Rio Tinto to Guinea in many ways is this. This is China. And what was happening in China in the 2000s, the major economic boom that had as one of its main consequences to completely shift the worldwide iron ore markets. And this graph shows worldwide iron ore imports in the 12 years between 2000 and 2012. And as you can see, China, which merely counts for 15% of worldwide iron ore purchases in 2000, by 2012 counts for 70% of worldwide iron ore purchases. And the same goes for worldwide steel production. And so one of the main consequences of this is to totally disrupt the iron ore pricing mechanism, which for a long time used to be set between Japanese steel mills and Australian and Brazilian mining companies. And hence, a new financialized system of pricing comes about. India blocks its exports, and Chinese steel mills cannot have enough steel from the domestic market, and hence they need to start buying internationally. And so you can see that the price of iron ore, which had remained stable for most of the second half of 20th century, suddenly in early 21st century totally explodes. So the reason for Rio Tinto in many ways in that time to get hold of Simandou was to keep competitors off it and have leverage so as to keep the price of iron ore higher on world markets, because main iron ore mines are located in China at a very nice distance, in Australia, and a very nice distance from China. So they could sell the products from their Pilbara mines in Australia at a higher price to the Chinese steel mills, and therefore make a higher margin without ever putting Simandou into exploitation. Now, this is one part of the story. The other part of the story is, and here I think this graph actually, I mean, this is how the mining industry in many ways views mines. So this is from an aggregate business information site, but it shows different worldwide iron ore mines, and they all have their marginal production price. And so if you imagine this is the importing price, can vary at different levels, and then at those levels, various mines become profitable or not. Simandou is an excellent mine because it becomes profitable already at very low prices. It contains quite a bit of mineral, and so holding on to that mine can have a considerable impact on the worldwide iron ore market. But the other reason to which Rio Tinto was so happy to hold on to Simandou was what was happening in 2007. So in 2007, BHP Billiton, another Anglo-Australian mining corporation, proposed to take over Rio Tinto. At the time, this would have been the largest M&A deal in history. The business press was getting crazy about it. But somewhat surprisingly or curiously, and to the dismay of some of Rio Tinto's shareholders, Rio Tinto as a company blocked at first those takeover attempts, and mainly by saying that whatever BHP Billiton was offering was underestimating the value of their project pipeline internationally. And so in 2007 in London, Sam Walsh, the head of iron ore at Rio Tinto, gave this exceptional talk. They showed how Rio Tinto is going to deliver exceptional growth. And suddenly this mountain chain in Guinea became one of the main points according to which Rio Tinto was saying that BHP Billiton was undervaluing its stock internationally. And then Rio Tinto came up with quite fabulous estimate. I mean, there's a graph from that presentation given in 2007 in London, where they said that Simandou would be able to produce as much as 1/3 of what Rio Tinto was currently producing in Pilbara. And they had other projects there in the pipeline too, but Simandou was the main one that then allowed them to show a much higher estimation, allowed them to therefore sort of over a very short period of time change very rapidly the estimates for the share price. Now, in the end, the deal then did not materialize, and actually Rio Tinto's share crumbled down, and then the financial crisis hit anyway. I have just taken out some snippets from the international business press at the time. But the other part, what happened then was that Rio Tinto had been telling the Guinean government all the time that Simandou contained about 2 billion tons of iron ore, of which only 1 point something are extractable. And then in their filings in 2007, they suddenly revealed, or perhaps lied, by telling the international business community that that Simandou really contained 8 to 11 billion tons of iron ore, which obviously angered the Guinean government, which started threatening the company and saying that we are going to revoke part of your. And then Rio Tinto engaged their international lawyers. I'm showing a letter from this law firm Herbert Smith, and in particular one of their partners, Stéphane Brabant, who's one of the main Africanist lawyers of the Paris bar, that were threatening the Guinean government. But Guinean government nonetheless proceeded. And so in 2006 already, the Guinean government had signed a protocole d'accord, or a memorandum of understanding, with this obscure little diamond mining company, BSGR, to whom they promised the first right of refusal over the Simandou blocks. Now, in parallel with this, they had also signed a number of agreements where they had promised to the fourth wife of then Guinean President Lansana Conté generous remuneration and a 5% share in the future mining endeavors, which, thanks to these court cases, we now have publicly available. I mean, it's quite a rare specimen of an international corruption contract. So in 2008, things materialized. We're not sure if it's because Rio Tinto had gone over their estimates were wrong. Anyway, half the rights have passed to BSGR. And BSGR in 2010 then sells 51% share in it to Vale for $2.5 billion. And the total invested, and this is including the price, is a maximum $160 million US. I mean, they did some geological exploration, but quite limited. But BSGR is acting very quickly. They were trying to sell their rights derivatives. This is from a slideshow that they were giving to Baosteel in Shanghai when they were trying to make Chinese investors buy the mining rights, because they were also consulting with the Libyan Investment Authority, BHP Billiton, Baosteel, Chinalco, and the China Investment Corporation. And here is a presentation that was given to Vale in Brazil, that Vale gave internally to show the strategic reasons why they should take over that part. So anyway, in the case of both those mining corporations, they have a form of accumulation in the absence of production, or in the absence of extraction even, perhaps. So it depends on how one then defines what extraction is. But there's a Rio Tinto share valuation goes up. BSGR is able to sell their mining rights to Vale for $2.5 billion. And Rio Tinto and Vale are both able to limit worldwide iron ore output and keep prices higher during a commodities boom led by Chinese industrialization. What I'm saying is that this is made possible in many ways thanks to the fact that all those mining companies had in their mining agreements with Guinea and in Guinean law investor-state dispute settlement clauses that said that whenever Guinean government was doing something that the mining companies charged in favorable or not in agreement with their contracts, then they don't need to settle those matters in Guinean courts, but they can directly sue Guinean state in a World Bank mediated or International Chamber of Commerce mediated arbitration proceedings, either in Paris or in London or Washington, D.C. But then for people in Simandou, these mining companies were expected. When I was there in 2019, there's an older man and former teacher who told me they better start mining. What else should they do? We want work. The mountain will help us develop. And indeed, you could see in many places in the area the remains of former geological exploration. In Damaro village, and this was used for storing children's equipment and market equipment, former container from BSGR. Rio Tinto leather boxes were littering villages from the time when people used to file complaints or ask for jobs in those boxes. And the ownership right that people would there have over the mountain chain was structured so that formally all land is owned by the state. This is a legacy of the French colonial regime, and it was kept the same way both under the soi-disant Marxist-Leninist regime of Sékou Touré and then later liberal regimes over the past 40 years. But then use rights are determined on a village scale based on lineage and arrival. And so mostly the people were seeing the mining companies as their strangers, themselves being hosts. And often strangers are expected to bring economic benefits to the hosts who accept them. And when there was high expectation for mining companies to come, there was land speculation, immigration from other parts of the country and region. And yet the attempt to have jobs and leverage the strangers for monetary income and prosperity failed. And numberless letters of revendication and protests were filed. Cars of Rio Tinto were burned. There was violent clashes between the mining companies and local inhabitants. And as a Guinean cartoonist illustrated the matter, it was as if the mountain of iron ore had become a mountain of shit, of which all these costumed men were drinking. So what I say that crucially, I mean, maybe here I summarize it better. I mean, the crucial thing is that the property over the same thing is constructed in different ways for these three different parties. And whereas for the people locally, their property was only structured through state and direct relations with the mining company to their community representatives, for the international mining companies, their relationship was directly with the Guinean executive power, whom then they could sue in investor-state arbitration. And I say that the ability to accumulate or to turn that asset into actual capital is dependent on scaling. For the international mining companies, they could internationalize it through their agreements, and whereas for the people in the Simandou mountain chain, their only intermediaries remain the local government or the community representatives of the mining companies. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Gustav. Very interesting. So the third and last speaker for this panel is Andrea Tollardo, who's a third-year PhD candidate at the University of Milano-Bicocca, who's presenting to us a paper titled Moving Ground, which is about histories of porphyry mining in Trento, Italy. So welcome.
I have a presentation, yes. I mean, it's not essential, but
yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, this
I
one.
have it in my yes.
Okay. Not that one. Maybe this one.
Okay.
I don't know. That's not a USB.
I mean, it's not essential actually.
It must be.
It's the main.
There's one in the back.
Wait, we need to, I think, duplicate.
Yeah, that should work. You wanna
Okay.
open it?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I'm good.
Okay. So my talk is about quarry mining, and specifically it's the, I'm focusing specifically on the historical part of my PhD thesis. So it's about one of the larger and longer lasting industries of the Trentino province in northern Italy that was developed in the mining sector in the municipalities of Albiano, Basilica di Pinè, Cembra, Lona Lases, and Fornace, of high quality porphyry stone used in the construction industry. The contemporary use of porphyry stone emerged from medieval community-based rights of use. However, industrial extraction of stone began in the 1920s, in the late 1920s, with construction companies from bordering Italian regions that were interested in gaining easy access to building materials in a period of expanding urban public works in the rest of Italy. They made use of an impoverished local valley peasantry who barely eked out a living by subsistence agriculture in the wake of the profound post-World War I crisis. Notwithstanding the extremely low wages earned in the quarries, though piecework, the informality of work relationships, and the political context of fascist corporatism deterred any kind of contestation and labor unrest. During the 1950s, the post-war economic boom surged in Italy and elsewhere, engendering a parallel boom in demand for building materials, among which Trentino's porphyry. When in the 1950s, the decades-long contracts of extraction that had been granted to big enterprises during the fascist regime drew to an end, and after strong contestations by local inhabitants, the municipalities where the quarries were located decided to break up quarry lots and distribute them to local inhabitants that requested a piece of the quarry. This process was inspired by an idea of a distribution and management of a local resource to local inhabitants that traces its roots in centuries-long institutional arrangements and in turn favored the creation of local workers' cooperatives. In the decade that followed, a mix of autonomous quarrymen, a genuine drive towards cooperative work, and the co-option of these trends by traditional big enterprises that continued to maintain a monopoly as regards the sales of the material, gave rise to a rearrangement of the local class equilibrium. Local enterprises, a selection and concentration occurred. Local enterprises emerged out of those that had gained access to the richer porphyry deposits and which conformed to an individualistic and hierarchic work ethic, subsumed to the logic of capitalist exchange value production and the ideal of the small family enterprise championed by the Christian Democratic Party that was dominant in the area under study. In the meantime, parallel processes of industrialization in the cities of the province drew in big industrial complexes that attracted both internal migrants as well as local mountain dwellers in search of work. It was now possible for many mountain dwellers to commute or move into a nearby valley instead of migrating permanently, as had been occurring since the last decades of the 1800s. Unionization expanded throughout the province, thanks to the national surge of labor unrest that continued to intensify under the beginning of the 1960s to the middle of the 1970s throughout Italy, which also reverberated in Trentino's stone quarries. The first collective labor agreements in porphyry quarries were signed at the peak of Italian labor struggles in 1973. Wages increased drastically, both in the whole of Italy, as well as in the porphyry extractive industry, where they even surpassed the wages in the industrial complexes of the lower valleys and the northwest of the country. A new autochthonous capitalist entrepreneurial stratum emerged out of the selection and concentration phase in the 5 main porphyry mountain towns. These family firms soon organized themselves along genealogic lines that rooted their essentialized connection to the locality with embeddedness in the towns and villages. Leading porphyry entrepreneurs who are also political figures with public roles in the municipal and provincial councils explicitly told me how important it was that the quarries remain in their hands because they are local people. The new class structure of the porphyry town became fixed into provincial law in 1980, governing mining industries that formally recognized the de facto privatization of quarries in the hands of the emergent entrepreneurs. Among other things, within the new law, the entrepreneurial geography became literally inscribed and thus locked in place. into the official cadastral maps that simply traced the mix of official and unofficial divisions of quarry lots that were distributed or granted to locals or have been taken over from one another. The 1980s also marked a period of turnover of labor, with a new generation of local workers slowly entering the sector, together with a parallel reduction of internal migrants from the south of Italy. The general national and international shift in the class power balance since the end of the 1970s and the establishment of the local legal and political framework, thanks to the 1980 provincial mining law, meant a slow but progressive degradation of work and wage conditions starting from the end of the decade. While wages remained high for most of the officially employed workforce during the 1990s, individualization and fragmentation of work relationships resulted in increasing job insecurity, illegal employment, and wage contraction for those without regular employment with the main mining companies. The 1990s and early 2000s also marked the years of the first arrivals of international immigrants in Italy, and the province of Trento, and especially the porphyry sector, attracted a greater number of them than the national average. The fall of the Christian Democratic Party in the wake of a nationwide corruption scandal at the beginning of the 1990s left a void in the Italian political environment that was filled by the rise of Forza Italia and the Northern League political parties. The same phenomenon occurred in the porphyry industrial area with the meteoric rise of a previously small right-wing regional autonomous party, PATT, together with the appearance of a regional branch of the Northern League that although did not expand as much as in the neighboring northern Italian regions. In 1993, the Northern League and PATT politicians in the porphyry entrepreneurs exploited a moment of crisis when the Italian judiciary seized all the dangerous stone-cutting machines of the industry due to their insufficient safety measures. Businessmen and politicians organized a successful protest that managed to occupy the provincial administrative headquarters in the province capital of Trento during a demonstration with hundreds of workers aligned with the businessmen's interests. Judges and bureaucrats were accused of stifling the right to work and profit from their mountains, uniting businessmen and many workers in the protest with a populist anti-tax and xenophobic rhetoric. During the same period, other subtler changes occurred. In the 1990s and early 2000s, some porphyry entrepreneurs began to diversify the sources of their profits, either through access to international building material markets, financialization, and siphoning away revenues in international investments, or the acquisition of stone quarries in Latin America. The amount of profits coming from international markets remained high, rising to more than half since the beginning of the 1970s on, and Trentino's porphyry came to constitute 20% of global sales of this material before the collapse of the industry in 2008. As a result, a significant amount of money relative to the lightly populated and poorly serviced area flooded the porphyry entrepreneurial strata. Notwithstanding the popularity of right-wing politics among part of the workforce, rapid changes in the extractive sector sparked a new wave of left-wing mobilization of the increasingly, especially migrant, individualized and disempowered labor force, under the initiative of a nucleus of radical and committed workers, both of local and foreign origin. The experience of past workers' struggles passed down to some members of the new generation of local workers brought into the sector in the middle of the 1980s, joined with the first generation of radical international immigrants. For a brief moment, during the middle of the decade, the porphyry industry was shaken by a wave of contestation sparked by the top-down imposition of regressive collective contract that increased piecework arrangements. However, although a 3-year-long mobilization succeeded in negotiating a better collective bargaining contract in 1998, the general trend of delocalizing production, financialization, and outsourcing, together with the high turnover of migrant workers who increasingly occupy those outsourced positions, made this limited achievement a Pyrrhic victory. Competition among businesses and easy profits drove an increase in production through the 1990s and early 2000s. By increasing the number of manual workers with progressively fewer paid piecework arrangements. The quality of the products began to undergo a degradation, and consequently, so did the prices international markets were willing to pay for them, forcing an additional increase in production until the bubble burst in 2007. In the meantime, another bubble on the other side of the Atlantic was about to explode, generating the interbank lending collapse that caused the Great Recession. Stone production, active quarries, and employment levels collapsed, fluctuating for a few years until they reached and leveled off at levels roughly equal to a third of those of the previous decade. So it is now necessary to briefly take a few steps back in history. A long tradition of administrative politics in what is now the province of Trento regarding mountain communities harks back to the modern era's Prince-Bishopric of Trent. In the area now roughly corresponding to the Trentino province, mountain rural communities were granted semi-autonomy on a variety of matters. Such autonomies were explicitly based on the landscape resource of the mountain, in the case of most of my area of research, what was called Montania Pinedi, which included pastures and forests, most often regulated as collective commons, while the little arable land available to be plowed was divided among small patriarchal proprietor families. The intersections and often conflicts between the logics behind the two property arrangements of collective resources and small private landed property were long-lasting features of mountain communities of the area. Notwithstanding the official abolition of Tirol's alpine communities statutes at the beginning of the 19th century, the communitarian understanding of the mountain resource remained in place until the next century, although eroded throughout the better part of that period. The continuation under different and transformed guises of the institutions of communities' autonomy after the abolition of the Prince-Bishopric in 1803 reached pre-modern administrative habits to the new Trentino province after its annexation to Italy 1 century later. The population living in Trentino's semi-autonomous communities, in fact, continued to interact with that territory during that period, almost as if institutional arrangements did not change at all. Both Tirol's and the Empire and the Austrian Empire's administrators demonstrated through a series of injunctions and reprimands their unsatisfaction with mountain communities' resistance to change, and specifically to what they called the purification of property from encumbrances and community uses. However, the need to secure loyalty of the population in a difficult conjuncture for the empire and successful appeals of such communities to ancien regimes, Habsburg's laws and institutions that were still active succeeded in maintaining in place the core principles of community autonomies and rights of use. Nonetheless, continuous pressures for change by the central power managed to slowly advance the application of the ideals of individual property and states' territorial homogenization. One of the measures taken was that of the allotment of pieces of the commons to single individual families that, even if only sporadically adopted during the period, began to be accepted as a legitimate way of managing the community land. The deep agricultural and economic crisis at both ends of the 19th century, the first due to Napoleon's invasions, the second due to the late 1800 Great Depression, pushed the commons into a sort of basic poor relief system for paupers of the mountain communities, thus keeping in place the need for their existence for locals. After World War I, the centralized Italian and later fascist state accelerated on the same trend of state homogenization, abolishing communitarian laws and the remnants of the commons and collective rights of use. However, soon after World War II and the return of community-based electoral politics, the theme of the commons came back through the protection of so-called usi civici, civic uses of common land resources. For 40 years, Trentino's branch of the Christian Democratic Party successfully mediated between continuing Trentino's Valley's demands for local municipal autonomy, the peculiarity of provincial autonomy, and the Italian political system. But the demise of the Christian Democratic Party in the early 1990s meant that the continuation of localistic interests and the jealous corporatist understanding of the locality had to be advanced with different political means. As hinted above, this occurred during a moment of an upturn in immigration and corruption scandals through the right-wing populism of the Northern League and the PATT parties in a so-called white province, where left-wing ideals and organizing have always been minoritarian. I'm going to the conclusion. In the stone mining municipalities, entrepreneurs and workers rooted their legitimacy of their profits in an idea of economic prosperity that referred to the perceived correct way to manage and follow those principles. They refer to an economic liberal utopia relating to a myth of direct production of economic prosperity born out of a hard work that is widely understood as culturally innate in the people of the area, and not only in the extractive municipalities. In the Vanoi Valley, on the other side of the same porphyritic Lagorai mountain range, where stone extraction occurs, SOCL also found a jealously individualistic work ethic deeply rooted in the old property relations of his area of research, which served as a hitch for the populist politics of hard work and anti-bureaucracy promoted by the Northern League and Forza Italia parties. If the remote Vanoy Valley experienced the decline of timber industry due to the worldwide tendencies of undercutting and overcapacity earlier than in the porphyry mining towns, the stone industry ended up in the same trap only a decade later. It happened because of the same trends of rising global trade and tariffs combined with transportation cost reductions that made the fortune of Trentino's porphyry, coupled with the failure of porphyry enterprises to rise up the value ladder. As I previously suggested, it seems that the jealous individualism and the closed corporate approach to outsiders that were so evident in SOCL's research, and which also seems to emerge out of my fieldwork, are related to what Eric Wolf called the closed corporate community, so widespread in the Alpine Crescent and in Trentino Mountains. In Trentino Alps, the prevalence of small property and corporate-based management of the commons had long-term effects in the creation of both the new classes and the adoption and diffusion of the economic liberal mythology. The translation of the Ancien Regime cosmological order of pre-industrial rural and mountain populations into that of liberal capitalism in most of Trentino's Alpine communities happened through the lens of the closed corporate community. The Christian democratic administration that long dominated electoral and administrative politics in Trentino directly promoted the distribution of the common resource to local inhabitants through a rhetoric of distribution rooted in the previous modalities of managing the commons through allotment, but in this conjuncture in an explicitly pro-small business enterprise scheme, coherently with national degli, Christian democracy, pro-small business policy that traced back to the fascist interlude. The establishment of the entrepreneurial strata inside the porphyry municipalities in that period, which was later fixed and formalized in the 1980 law, and from then on de facto appropriation of quarry lots in the hands of the families who managed them, made it nearly impossible for new workers to pursue the same entrepreneurial goal as before the golden age of lots distribution in the 1950s and 60s. The principal way in which most workers have been co-opted in the ideal of hard work, in which their perceived interests became aligned with that of the entrepreneurs, has been the nearly ubiquitous use of extremely individualized piecework arrangements. These arrangements began from the very inception of the industry in the 1920s and have been implemented either in formalized contracts or more often through verbal or tacit agreements. I conclude with a quote from a retired quarryman. Here in the quarries, you are at your station. Who do you see? Your co-worker behind you or ahead of you? That's it. I mean, you always see the same people. In the quarry, it's like working in a field as a farmer. It's not that you see 100,000 people, you see only the same people. Thank you.
So thank you all for these very interesting papers and great opening panel. I also realized I didn't introduce myself earlier. I just started introducing speakers, but my name is Johanna Markkula, and I'm a new assistant professor at the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology here at CEU. So I'll just give some brief comments, and then I want to keep them brief in order to give ample time for questions from the audience as well. So I'll just try to synthesize a little bit and put the papers in conversation. So I'll point to some of the similarities that I noted, and also I think some of the differences within these similarity or common themes. So the first common theme that I wanted to point to is the concept of, or the idea of time or temporality. And I think, firstly, all these three papers do a really fantastic job at historicizing the processes of extraction in their respective contexts, and where some are presented with these multiple temporalities of extraction and the changing forms of extraction over time, and also how they interact with local populations, with labor, and with more macro processes like state policies and transnational legal frameworks, and international capitalist corporations and so forth. So in Andrea's case, which we ended with, we really get a great insight into these longer histories of stone extraction in Trento, and how it moved from these commonly used and extracted resources in local Trentino, what do you say, semi-autonomous, right, communities and quarries, into this kind of institutionalization of the privatization of these common resources through small-scale capitalist and patriarchal, like the gendered and class lineages of these family firms. And then also like the co-current or parallel histories of labor struggles and politics, and the exploitation later of new forms of labor, with the arrival of new migrants, which seems to have undermined also some of the previous gains in workers' rights and wages. And then in Gustav's case, we get this really nice, clear introduction to the colonial legacies and histories that have shaped the processes of extraction in Guinea, and also through this establishment of the transnational legal frameworks after decolonization that seem to then override these national legislations, allowing contemporary corporations then to extract resources even against the desire of the formal owner of the land, which is the state. But we also have this other different temporality here, which is really interesting, the future. And I didn't hear you mention speculation very much, but I feel like there's a lot on speculation that is playing out in these processes. And then also on the theme of temporality there, I think it's interesting in the way that it works through these delays and blockages, in the sense of freezing these mining extractions to manipulate the market, both by blocking other companies from accessing or extracting the resource, but also manipulating markets and prices and keeping this sort of untapped iron ore away from the global supply chain to drive up the prices of iron ore for mines operated elsewhere. So capital accumulation without extraction, in that sense. And then finally, in Vasiliki's case, we have another future-oriented form of temporality, in the sense of mining minerals for renewable energy, and where climate change was this sort of temporal present and future, caused by historical forms of extraction, then it's used to justify and legitimize and produce new forms of extraction too, in extracting these metals for solar panels and wind turbines and so forth. So that was the time connection between the three papers. And second theme that I feel converge in these three papers that I want to highlight is the focus on the different forms of socialities that are emerging through these processes of extraction. So in Vasiliki's case from Greece, there are multiple forms of socialities in terms of new collaborations, what you call the counter spillover effects, in the form of organized resistance and demonstrations and solidarity movements and so on, both on a local and international level, then emerged in reaction to the extraction of copper in Greece. And then in Gustav's case, we're introduced to the local populations represented here by Muhammad and his father, and their expressed desire that surprised you for companies to bring their mining operations to their particular villages. And the way that they interpreted this arrival, or this bringing the companies there through this local framework or paradigm of stranger-host relationships, where extraction then was not just welcomed but desired. And also, I think you bring out really nicely like the socialities in the political connections and corruption strategies of the government through kinship connections. There was the wife of the president and so forth, and also the socialities of the corporation representatives that are negotiating these deals. And then in Andrea's case, finally, the different constellations of these communities, the mountain dwellers, the workers and family firms, and the way that they are particularly gendered and classed in their forms, new class formations and these politics that emerge around and in response to the mining of these porphyry stones. So I want to give at least 15 minutes for questions and discussions. So I'll open up the floor for questions from the audience. Yes, please come in.
To all three of these studies, wonderful papers. Together, they really provided a sense of cartographies of extractivism, and that was just extremely useful. I had a question or a series of thoughts for Gustav to just sort of push the conversation around. Really interested in how you centered property and the contract in your analysis, Gustav. And of course, on the one hand, property and contract was at the heart of Marx's description of the conditions of possibility of capitalist accumulation. You're showing how it's at the heart of the conditions of possibility of financialization. But it's also the third thing that it's at the heart of is the logics of the corporate form, as Veblen showed, right? I mean, Veblen describes corporation as a formal coalition of ownership. So Veblen gives us this definitional link between the institutional form of the corporation and the property form.
Right? And you're showing, I think, how this attaches to investment, leverage, financialization. So I'm interested in sort of situating your analysis in relation to two moves, right? And the first is that there's a certain anthropological lineage that studies corporate extractivism and links it to alienation and the alienation of dispossessed communities. And this especially in the work of someone like Miktausik, right? So how does the shift of your ethnographic gaze to the investor and investor state logics open up different kinds of understandings of the dynamics of capital other than alienation, and why might that matter? And the second question is that in this research, you're offering a glimpse into the contemporary colonial and imperial lives of property. Now, Brenna Pandar, in her book, Colonial Lives of Property, shows how the contractual form of property relation is constitutively racialized. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more, in what ways does your work contribute to a theorization of racialized capitalism? In other words, I'm interested in the sort of possibility for linking financialization, alienation, and racialization, and the place of the property form, the legal instrument of contract, and the institution of the investor state in materializing these relations in conjunctural ways that afford us maybe new possibilities for theorizing imperialism.
Sorry. Yes, thank you very much for these three presentations. I really appreciate them and the way in which they were resonating with each other. Instead of a longer comment, two quick questions. One about Greece. it's a kind of easy question. I saw a lot of flags with slogans in Italian. I know that many Italian people, particularly from the Balti-Susa movement, participated in campings and so on. I just like to hear a bit more about this transnational dimension of the movement you have been describing. And then a question for Gustav that is in a way close to the one asked by Kaushik, meaning that I was kind of fascinated, as you may easily imagine, by your emphasis on accumulation in the absence of production. This kind of future prospect that allows accumulation of capital even without any kind of production or extraction. From this point of view, I'm not sure the framework provided by Caterina Pistor is enough to understand what is going on. An asset plus a legal code. Isn't there something else at stake and at work that enables such a magic process of accumulation without production? Thank you very much.
Yeah, a very technical question to Gustav. How did you obtain the corporate presentations that you showed in the presentation? Thank you. Maybe I will ask another one to Gustav as well, like kind of building off what Sandra was asking. I thought it was really fascinating the fact that you, thinking back to what the presentation that Sandra gave kind of suggested about this double value or this double system of valuation. It seems like your case is just a fantastic one to really think about that double value, right? Because you have, they're somewhat decoupled, which is very rarely we get to see in an environment in which there is no value understood in like classical Marxist terms of labor or extraction, but there is added value that is created by creating an imagination of the future, in which in fact the extraction will be a problem, because then you realize that maybe the numbers are not as high as they can put on the paper. So I just wanted to kind of hear more you thinking to this double valuation maybe. So I guess it's not really a question, more like I want to hear what you think about it. All right.
Thank you for these talks. I also have a question for Gustav. I'm thinking to go back a little bit to Sandra's keynote. I'm thinking a little bit about this question of contemporary capital's extractive logistical and financial operations as a kind of counter-revolutionary project, which came up briefly. And if we think about these questions as a kind of counter-revolutionary project, certain instruments are needed for that kind of project. And it seems to me it would be quite tempting to think of these kind of investor-state arbitration courts as an instrument of that kind, roughly. I mean, it might be a very sort of heavy-handed way of thinking about them, but I guess I'm also thinking about Manu Karuka's work on counter-sovereignty, Al Lumba's writing about counter-decolonization. I wonder if you would be tempted to see these kinds of arbitration courts in that frame. Of course, in this case, from what I understand, Guinea actually was able to win their case against the corporation, which might not necessarily be what we would expect from a kind of World Bank court. But if these kind of long-term trends in the kind of structure of capitalism are in some ways a reaction against decolonization, against the sort of social structures which sort of threw off earlier forms of rule, then I wonder how we might place these kinds of courts in that framework or in that longer history.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for these questions. I'll start perhaps with the very easy, quick question: how do you update documents on the World Bank website? This is a unique case of investor-state arbitration. It's a mechanism that has been criticized a lot, right? Especially in Europe with TTIP and CETA and all these various agreements. And so some of those tribunals started publicizing more and more material, but this is a unique case in which not only was there publication of the videos of the hearings, but most submissions, and also including, and this is really unique, exhibits that the parties submit. So I got these documents from the exhibits of that case, and then I also used Court Listener to get, which is a journalist's database to get access to US court filings, and then some things that were rendered public in UK court filings also. And then I had further, I think I can't actually use that we obtained together with journalists in France and Guinea, when the Guinean government was secretly negotiating new mining deals with Chinese investors. So, and then to respond, who made somebody else take another question?
Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Okay, common grounds between Greece and Italy. There are lots, and
it's a long list.
It's a long history, and it's rather years, but I think that okay, speaking on an academic level, because methodologically, I think it's interesting to start discussing and investigating from the social relations and the struggles that are taking place. So I think it's quite interesting to figure out how these common grounds were created. And I would say most particularly during the last 20 years, there have been like very close relations between Greece, and in particular northern Greece, the area of Thessaloniki, and some places in Italy. We've been following very closely all the traditions of the Italian autonomia, so there have been relations established the last 20 years from people from Milano and the surroundings. So I think that these relations, people were based in these relations to circulate the struggles. I mean, we were in touch with the Val Susa and Notav, but also with other struggles, the Segrosha Montana and the ZAD, the struggles with the airport. So there was a network over there, which I think was based on common grounds that were created like beforehand. Common, I think, understandings of theoretical discussions on primitive accumulation and the permanence of the primitive accumulation and accumulation by dispossession, all the the famous special issues of common air and all the Italian traditions. So I think all this discussion generates new networks and new struggles. We did have also Greek slogans over there. Then I realized that most of the slogans that they did show were in Italian. That would be weird, yes. But again, yeah, that's true. That's true. But it depicts, I think, also these common grounds. Yeah.
I'll just maybe say in a summarized fashion of bringing the questions together, about the question about alienation and imperialism and the double logics. I mean, clearly, these in many ways a case in which there isn't labor exploitation in classical Marxist terms. If there is anything, there is a desire for labor exploitation. People in Guinea, the main desire was to get jobs, and I think it's. There's literature already on how this the classical Marxist frame does not work so well in the context of an international division of labor, in the context where many parts formerly used to be on the third world, there are countries in which most people are outside the formal labor force and a regular salaried relationship, right? And so it's working in a way, of course, then the corporate form is important. And one can theorize whether there's a classical law theorist, you can theorize a corporation either as an allegation of contracts or an allegation of property also. But but in many ways, in taking the questions together, I mean, obviously, Caterina Pister is not, doesn't offer the full theory, but offers perhaps some part of an analytical framework to then understand the part of legal techniques within financialization. And in these terms, I mean, saying that in capital, no longer the labor relation, but the asset condition had become a primary mode of accumulation. It's not new. And Marx didn't say exactly, but it also depends when people are writing. So Marx is saying it wasn't yet so prevalent. But by the time of writing, of some writings of Tolstoy and Bedlin, and especially John Collins in the 1920s, this had become, predominant. And of course, there is a moment in the after-war period when it becomes less dominant, and then it becomes again more. And really, there are rich histories of financialization and also the changing of the logic of corporations to become increasingly financialized. I think that the mining industry has always been financialized, even in like early 20th. Even if you look at Rio Tinto is formed as a company late 19th century in London to start mining exploitations in Spain, for which they then gather international capital in London. So I think that the speculative nature has been in so many booms and false claims in mining history. It's very rich in that. But in my analysis, the scale part of it is very important. And so then to come to the question of sort of the counter-revolutionary statement. So on the history of international investment arbitration, there have been some disputes in the historiography of that mechanism, which in large part was put in place in the 1960s during the dismantling of European colonial empires. And whilst it seems at first logical to think that it might have been multinational corporations that were pushing for it at first to keep their property in the newly independent states, but historians have established that in many ways it wasn't, that they judged it was better for them to negotiate through governments. And it was sort of a set of World Bank bureaucrats at the time. So World Bank was quite a different, it's before Washington Consensus, right? It's still the developmentalist World Bank at the time, and who had that vision that they could, that this would be for the development and for the betterment of the world economy. And it seems that many of the third world countries at that time, at least, were also for putting in place such a system. I think especially the work of Johanna Markkula, for instance, who has shown how, in the 60s, before the new international economic order debates, the structural adjustment was positively wanted by people like Che Guevara. So, but then there is a change is operated, and this legal mechanism from a variety of governments also signed those deals without not knowing what exactly would come up to them as an avalanche. So in the 90s, this legal mechanism truly becomes used by international corporations against governments. And that Guinea would win a case in many ways, it's not so rare. And statistically, I think it's more or less half and half, but it's more often what matters is the threat of that possibility. And I think that scaling labor of this particular mechanism and its importance for accumulation through asset conditioning has really been put forward by, I think that book very slightly exaggerates the role of this legal mechanism by Quinn Slobodian and globalists, and where he says that it was in particular, a group of fractions within the neoliberal movement who were trying to push for a separation of economy and politics at different scales, and that led to then creating of some of the international architecture that came about in the Bretton Woods, but also before already the International Chamber of Commerce is from the interwar setup with the League of Nations. I think he slightly exaggerates the importance of these people. I mean, in the end, it's the corporations that need to put it to use, and their lawyers. But clearly, there is also the counter-revolutionary parts in the system. But in many ways, it's also sort of unexpected consequences. That in the 90s, suddenly a bunch of law firms start ambulance chasing claims against governments to then start suing countries.
We're unfortunately out of time. We're 5 minutes overdue for our lunch break, but I do invite everyone to continue the conversations and ask questions to our great panelists during the break, and we'll be back at 1:30. 2:30.
Yes, 2 hours.
2 hours lunch.
petition